Welcome to Micro Frontends for Java Microservices. Oh, one thing I do want to do, where's my phone? Oh, it's right here. So, as you can imagine, as a developer advocate, like I tell my boss I'm going to go and do an Ireland jug tour, and they're like, really? So, I have to take a selfie with y'all in the background so I can like prove to him that I'm working, you know? So, here we go. Ready? 1, 2, 3. There we go. Okay, now that's out of the way. I also learned a cool thing tonight that I didn't know. Like, my screen is mirrored, right? So I don't have any speaker notes here. But there's actually a Keynote app on your phone that, sure enough, I got all my speaker notes on my phone. So that's pretty cool. Does anyone know where this bridge is or what the name of the bridge is? Groton, is that what you said? Yeah. Yep. That's correct. So I got it off Unsplash there, and yeah. Oh, actually, no, I purchased it off iStock Photo, so I didn't have to credit anyone, right? Usually you credit someone at the bottom, right? But I paid like 10 bucks for it or whatnot. So my name is Matt Raible. I'm a hick from the sticks. I'm also an old-fashioned Java developer, hence the whiskey. So I grew up in the backwoods of Montana with no electricity, no running water. I had to actually walk 2 miles to the bus stop every day. But the cool thing was in the winter, we got to ski, right? So I got a lot of cross-country skiing in as a kid. I live in Denver, Colorado with my beautiful wife, Trish, and our 2 lovely children, Jack and Abby. You can tell this is a dated photo because Jack is the tallest one in the family now, and he's like 6 inches taller than me. So if you have like teenagers, 12 or 13, the amount that they grow between 13 and 15, 16 is astounding, right? It's like they go from this to like, whoa, crazy kids. I also have a middle child. His name is Hefe. I bought him off eBay in 2004, and it took me 12 years to make him look like this. He's got a Porsche engine, Porsche transmission, all custom suspension, and boy, is he fun to drive. I work for a company called Okta. My dad calls it Okra. And I did get him to, yeah, he's Okta now. He's still not Okta, but he's Okta. It's cool. The actual name means a unit of cloud measurement. And so it's a meteorological term. And if it's an 8 octa day, it means that it's fully cloudy. There's, no blue sky anywhere. If it's a 0 octa day, which we get in Denver a lot, there's not a cloud in the sky. So it's kind of a cool, name for a company there. I also am happy that we bought Auth0 a couple of years ago or a year ago because they really seem to understand developers better, right? Okta's more like corporate, kind of talking to the CISOs and the CTOs, whereas Auth0, like developers love them. And when they joined us, Eugenio Pace is their CEO. And I went out and looked at his bio, and I was like, oh man, this guy and I are best friends. So in his spare time, he enjoys outdoors, rowing, riding bikes, right? I like to ride bikes, spending his time with his family, and restoring his 1970 Karmann Ghia, which is also a Volkswagen, right? So my Volkswagen recently won Best of Show in Colorado, and I was pretty excited about that, right? Dream come true at like one of the largest Volkswagen shows. So I emailed Eugenio and was like, here's my bus. What's your Karmann Ghia look like? And he sends back like a frame, right? It's just wheels on a frame. He's like, I got some ways to go, right? But it's a project. So another funny story is Todd McKinnon is our CEO. And his dad calls Auth0 Auth0. So we all have dad problems with pronouncing our companies, basically. So today we're going to talk about a brief history of microservices. And I don't know if that light is washing out that screen. Is it a bit for you? Because it's also the light on me, so I don't know if that'll affect anything. But maybe kill it a bit, and we'll get some more color there. Not those ones. Is that better? Yeah? All right. So we'll do a brief history of microservices, then we'll talk about microservices with Java, with JHipster, and then I'll do the intro to micro front ends. And we'll see where we are in time because we did want to have a break, in the middle. And maybe I'll do the demo after the break or something like that. And then I'll talk about securing microservices with OAuth 2.1. So microservices is funny because it's been around for quite some time. It didn't really come to fruition in like the Java ecosystem until about 2014, 2015, but it was mentioned at conferences by Microsoft as far back as like 2006, 2007. A lot of times they called it micro web services. But James Lewis, Martin Fowler, and Adrian Cockcroft, who's down on the left there, and Jill Wallens get a lot of credit for basically taking it to the masses. So Adrian Cockcroft, who was at Netflix at the time, described the architecture as like fine-grained SOA. And I think, you know, a lot of times you look at microservices and you're like, isn't this just service-oriented architecture all over again, right? And so we do seem to come back every 20 years, right, to something we already had. And he pioneered the style at WebScale, as did Joe Wallens, Dan North, Evan Botcher, and Graham Tackley. So there's a lot of people involved. But really kind of what changed things, at least for me, in like the Java space, was when Martin Fowler and James Lewis wrote an article titled simply Microservices, right? They published it on March 25th, 2014. I think that date is important, so kind of keep in mind. Years later, it's still kind of considered the definitive article about microservices, so I'll touch on some points that they made in that article. First of all, how many people in the room are using microservices like at their company? Okay, so we got about 75%, almost all of y'all. Okay, so one of the things he mentions in this article is Conway's Law, and that is any organization that designs a system will produce a design whose structure is similar to the communication structure of the organization. And so this is way back in like 1967. So if you relate that to microservices and you actually have structured your development teams as like UI specialists, maybe middle tier specialists that do Java, and then DBAs, like you're gonna have a hard time developing microservices because it leads to siloed application architectures because of Conway's Law. And so you will have people that are UI specialists that instead of actually doing something and communicating with the middle tier folks to do something, they'll do it on the UI, right? They'll do it in JavaScript or whatever just to make, because they can make it happen quicker. So, you know, the basic philosophy of Unix is do one thing and do it well, and that's very similar to microservices, right? Try to make it small, and I think that's probably the hardest part with microservices is figuring out what does it encapsulate, right? Does it encapsulate, you know, these 3 business domains or 1? And now people talk about like nano microservices, right? And you're like, is that like a field in an entity? Like, what is that, right? So it's tough to do that. And no single program basically represents the whole of the microservices architecture, right? A lot of times it's all of them pieced together, and then it might be pieced together like on the front end, right? And a lot of times what we've seen in JHipster, and I'll get into this more in a moment, is basically like the microservices backend is beautiful. It's all nice and segregated and everything, and then the front end, and I saw this at a lot of companies when I was an independent consultant as well, that's a monolithic UI. And you're like, you're kind of doing it wrong there, because if you change anything in the back end, you know you have to deploy the front end again. So
I was really into science, and I kind of wanted to be maybe an astronaut or work for NASA in some capacity. We grew up watching Star Trek, Stargate, Red Dwarf, all these different programs. I think Stargate was probably the biggest influence because there was a female character in that was one of the main leads, and she was a physicist, and so it kind of made you think like that's possible as a female. So I went to uni and did physics with astrophysics for my degree, and then I decided to keep going with that, and I stayed in academia to do a PhD. Astrophysics isn't as far from software development as you might think. It's really about solving problems using mathematical skills and software development. I ended up being really more passionate about programming and solving problems that way than actually about astrophysics. I just started applying for jobs in Belfast for software development, and I found Liberty IT. They took people from a background in STEM subjects, so science, technology, engineering and maths. Liberty's focused on diversity and diversifying the workplace because they realise that a diverse workplace actually is better at problem solving and better at coming up with solutions for the customer. So my previous life as an astrophysicist might seem worlds apart from my career in Liberty IT, but the skills I learned just generally solving problems on a daily basis has really helped me in Liberty IT, and I've used it every day.
So that's kind of funky, but you know, Java is a great language to use when you're building a microservices architecture. In fact, in our industry, some of the biggest names use Java, like Netflix, Amazon, Twitter. There's also eBay, LinkedIn, right? All of these have written a lot of their back-end systems and microservices with Java. So you can tell that it can handle incredible traffic. And the funny thing about the traffic and scalability is often microservices aren't there to actually do scalability. They're more there to scale people. So I worked at LinkedIn back in 2007 and 8. I also worked at Overstock in like 2013. And now I work at Okta. And guess what they all had in common? Monoliths. Right? Scaling is not a problem with a monolith. It's a problem with people. If you have 1,000 developers working on a product, you need for people to be able to just isolate the code and work on their little thing and push that up to the cloud or whatnot, right? Instead of at LinkedIn, people had to wait till Thursday afternoon, and then the release could go out, right? And even when we were developing, this is 2007, they gave us MacBook or Mac Pros, right? The big towers, right? And a MacBook Pro. And we got to choose between like a 30-inch monitor or two 27-inch monitors. So working at LinkedIn was like really cool. It was like, wow, we get $10,000 worth of hardware like right off the bat. But a lot of it was because it took 20 minutes to start their whole stack. And so as a developer, right, if you didn't start it in debug mode, you're like, oh man, I got to restart it again. And we had actually embarked on this project called FINEOS, right, because it was rising from the ashes, to like rewrite it all using OSGI. Right? And so I was on that project, and it was kind of like, I really discovered a lot of problems with OSGI, and a lot of just the libraries didn't have the manifests or whatever they needed to be OSGI compliant, right? And so I remember like struggling with FreeMarker or Velocity or something like that and really having a hard time getting things to work. But then the lead architect, who is also a founder of LinkedIn, was in the shower one day, and you know what he figured out? He was like, oh, we can make the Ant build in a parallel process. And it went from 20 minutes to 5 minutes, and they were like, we don't need the FINEOS project. But fast forward, right, like 15 years later, and LinkedIn is very much built on a microservices architecture, except one of the things that they've done is a lot of their microservices are written in different languages and frameworks, right? Even when I was there, they were starting to experiment with Node and Ruby on Rails and Grails, and then I think they do a lot with Scala now. They do a lot with Play. And they've actually hired some pretty big names in our industry to work there. So I like what they're doing, but it just goes to show that, you know, microservices wasn't their problem, or scalability wasn't their problem. It was actually people, you know, and you want to be able to have an autonomous team that is everywhere from a database to a product owner to someone that maintains it in production, right? That's like the beautiful microservices team is like a 10-person team, or what did Amazon call it, like a 2-pizza team, right? You only need to hire or order 2 pizzas to feed everyone. And then you can get stuff done because you're not dependent on other people around you. We all know that doesn't always work as nice as they say it does, but that's the ideal situation to actually use microservices successfully. So a lot of times what I tell people, and Martin even says this in his article, is the first thing you want to do with microservices is say no. Say, let's do the monolith, right? Or let's do the monolith first. And then we'll migrate to microservices if we need to, especially if you're just a 10-person company or a startup, right? Because chances are you can iterate faster. It's only when you get to like hundreds of developers that you might have a problem, you know, scaling up your teams. And the other thing is, what was a quote from a guy at RedMonk? He was saying when web shops grow up, they become Java shops. And for the longest time, I was always like, that's pretty cool. Like, Java's awesome, right? No wonder he says that. But the reason that he said that, I listened to like one of his talks a couple years back, and he was like, because there's so many Java developers. So at some point, these companies can't hire any more Scala developers or Ruby on Rails developers or whatever. There aren't any, right? And so they're like, well, I guess we'll use Java. Plenty of developers there. So you're in a good spot is what I'm trying to say. So, you know, the Java ecosystem has some well-established patterns for developing microservices, and a lot of that comes from Spring. If you're familiar with Spring, you'll be right at home with Spring Boot and Spring Cloud. And there's a strong correlation, I think, between microservices in Java and like the microservices article and Spring Boot and Spring Cloud. Because the microservices article was March 25th, 2014. And Spring Boot 1.0 was April 1st, 2014. That's like within the same week. And you know, it's funny, if you look back at the history of Spring, how many people read Ron Johnson's book about J2E design and development? No? You guys are too young, that's why. Like, I'm the only old guy in the room, right? That's like, oh yeah, I read that 20 years ago. Yeah, it was a while ago, right? And so he basically wrote that, and at the time, everyone was doing a lot of XML, a lot of EJBs with J2E, and it was just painful. There was an XDoclet tool that came out that kind of eased the pain, and I took that and used it in my AppFuse project and didn't even use EJBs, and people were very excited to be able to use, you know, hybrid entities directly with their services or even in their controllers or in their struts actions and be able to do stuff without EJBs. So he kind of started the whole movement. 2004 Spring 1.0 came out and it was a massive success, right? A lot of people were like, let's get rid of EJBs, let's just use that. It does a lot of the same stuff. And in 2006, they came out with Spring 2.0 with better XML. So they had these XSDs that allowed you to write less XML. But for the most part, between 2009 and like 2013, it became known as XML hell, right? It used to be like EJB hell or whatever, but now it was XML hell. And it was because basically developers weren't upgrading stuff. They invented Java config in 2009 and no one used it. They just liked their XML or there was no migration path or whatever, so they stuck with that. At the same time, that was part of the stagnation in Java between Java 7 and 8. I don't know if you remember, but 8 took like 5 years or something like that, right? 7 was pretty cool, but it was just nothing in between. It might have been because, you know, Oracle bought Sun or whatever, but there was a lot of stagnation. And then Spring Cloud was just a year later, so that was kind of the one that allowed people to use like the Netflix tools to really build their microservices architectures quick and easy.
Hi, it's Jerry Nolan here from Stack & Co. If you're stuck in your job, considering your next career move, or even just curious what the software engineering job market is like out there at the moment, reach out to me at Stack & Co. We'll have a confidential conversation, go over your career aspirations, your goals, and how to progress your career to get there. And if the timing is right for you, we can introduce you to some of the best software engineering career opportunities available in Ireland today. Reach out to me via our website, stackand.co.
So Spring Boot does Java very well, and I like to say it's like the on-off switch of enterprise Java. I use it all the time. I love it. It automatically configures Spring whenever possible, right? It's got all its starters in there, and instead of you having to tweak every little thing, you basically just drop a dependency in, and it recognizes it's Postgres, and it sets up a URL, and it's beautiful, right? I mean, it took them so long to do it that maybe they just worked on it that long, but if you think back, like Ruby on Rails was one of the first ones to use convention over configuration, right? They were just like, put this here and it'll work. And that was 2005 or 6, right? And so it's crazy that it took us till 2014 in Java land to be like, okay, we can do that. And then now Micronaut and Quarkus have done similar things, right? So it's kind of a joyous time to be alive as a Java developer and have, you know, this rich frameworks around. And if you think back, the last time we had that was 2004. And that was when Spring 1.0 came out. And the funny thing about Spring 1.0 is in the same week, you know what else came out? Flex 1.0 and JSF 1.0, right? And JSF 1.0 I think was, I think Ajax was coined like 2 months before it in like February of that year, right? And then JSF's like, look, you can do server-side rendering. And everyone's like, we're over that, right? And all the JavaScript stuff. So, you know, a lot happened around there. jQuery came out, and, you know, the JavaScript renaissance all started, so a lot going on. So Spring Framework 5 was released in September 2017, which seems like a long time ago now, right? Like 5 years ago. And it builds on Reactor and Reactive Stream specification, and it includes a new runtime component known as Spring Webflux. And so Spring Boot 2.0 added Webflux, and you know, this is 2017. No, that was released in March 1st, 2018. So there hasn't been a major release of Spring Boot in almost 4 years. Like I think 2.5 they called a major release, right? But it wasn't a major feature like Webflux. And so the reactive stack allows you to be reactive basically instead of blocking, you know, your database connections or your message queues or whatever. It's all non-blocking, so you can handle more throughput. And the reason they did this was because Spring had a lot of large customers maybe some of your investment banks that you talk to or whatever that, were actually spending millions of dollars a year or maybe even a month on their cloud bill. And by using Webflux and using less resources, they could save, millions of dollars a month. So it became a big deal for a lot of those large customers. For those of us that, might be developing, like my production is blog posts, right? Once they're published. That's the beauty of Developer Advocate. You only test on Chrome, and production is when you publish, right? And so that's a nice thing there. But Spring Webflux can be very useful, and what a lot of people ask is, when should you use Spring Webflux versus Spring MVC? And the answers I've gotten is basically performance differences are negligible unless you are doing a lot of API calls at a scale of at least 500 requests per second. So that's a fair amount, right? Up until that point, they're pretty much equal. Like Spring MVC, Spring Webflux will have very similar performance. The difference is in the code. Basically, this is a Spring MVC code from a JHipster app that I wrote, and you can see it's very procedural, right? It does a little debugging, a little error checking, and then it saves the points in the database, and then it saves it in Elasticsearch repository, and then it returns a response, right? And it's just kind of, one after the other kind of thing. If you look at that same code, because JHipster supports Webflux, it's very chained, right? At the bottom there, you return the points repository, you save it, and then you flat map it to the search repository, and then you map those results back to the return that you return to the client. So, a major difference here is 14 lines of code versus 22, right? And of course, you could get creative and push things up or whatever, but, this is like the default formatting in IntelliJ, so, typically you look at the Spring MVC example and Java developers can recognize how it works. This one, they're like, oh, that's tough. And admittedly so, when we migrated to Webflux in JHipster, or when we added that feature, it took us about a year, right? And most people are volunteers on the project, so it wasn't anyone's full-time job, but the syntax is just tough to get your head around and actually use it. So what a lot of people ask, though, is what about Project Loom, right? Does Loom make it so we don't need reactive architectures? And the answer is, well, maybe. The problem is Loom is all about threading and virtual threads and stuff like that, and if you're writing web apps with Spring MVC, you're probably not doing any threading or anything in there, so it's going to be at a lower level. It's going to be like Tomcat doing it, right? Or it's going to be Jetty or whatever web server you're using, and if they do reactive coding and implement Loom, it's possible you'll get better performance, but still you're going to have those blocking things like a database driver, right? So if you want the performance that you can get with reactive, then you're still going to need like the Postgres reactive database driver, right? And so what I like about this whole thing is a lot of it is just like the Java Streams API and learning how to use that with flat map and map and all that kind of stuff. So learning it, I don't think is a terrible skill, right? I think you'll find benefits other ways if you start to learn how to use, Spring Webflux.
Every clinical trial starts with a question. At Teckro, we asked, why is it so complicated to run clinical trials? We asked, what if? What if you could see who is interacting with your study in real time? What if you could be certain site staff always had only current, approved documents? What if you could proactively implement improvements based on site feedback? What if you could deliver tailored messages with the right information at the right time for the right people? We transform your paper protocol into a digital hub of communication and collaboration. Teckro is a single cloud-based platform that provides all study stakeholders with the knowledge they need when they need it, even at the point of care. Today, Teckro is used by large pharma and emerging biotechs to manage trials around the world, supporting all therapeutic areas, all phases, and any trial model. Simple, intuitive, and easy to use, there's no doubt why site staff around the world rely on Teckro, the hub for communication and collaboration. Study answers neatly in your pocket. Have a question? Teckro the answer. Visit teckro.com for more information.
Webflux. And so, starting to feel a little hip talking about all this hipster stuff. But then I'm gonna lose my mic. And it'd be funny because none of you in the room would notice, right? But everyone on the live stream would be like, we can't hear him anymore. So let me make sure I put that back on. Right there. Hopefully that's good. Let me know if it isn't. So JHipster goes a step further than Spring Boot and Spring Cloud and actually allows you to generate Spring microservices. So it uses all the same stuff that you would use if you were writing it yourself. It just generates it for you. So the thing I like most about that is no one says that you have to use JHipster to start a new project, because if you're working at an enterprise, like, new projects are few and far between, right? It just doesn't happen that much. So I encourage people to like look at the code it generates and then maybe learn from that. It also has 70% test coverage, like, on a lot of the code, so you can learn how to test a lot of things. So this blog post, you'll see I wrote it. You like the tattoos there? See those? Okay, even got an angular one. So I wrote that back in 2021 at the beginning of the year, and it was on JHipster 7, which we are still doing. We're still iterating on JHipster 7. The Spring Boot 3 is going to force us to go to JHipster 8, so that might be in the next couple of months. But just like the reactive stuff, we have had hard times in the past getting the migrating to the major versions of Spring Boot. The cool thing is I just got Spring Boot 3 working like today at 3 in the morning. And my laptop died right after I got it all to start up. And it was serendipitous, right? I was like, now it's time to quit. Sweet. So this blog post goes over how to develop reactive Java microservices using Spring Web Flux. And you might be asking, what the heck is he talking about? What is JHipster? And so it started as a project in 2013 that generated AngularJS code, right, which required no compilation or anything, and Spring backend. And that was it. That's all it really did. And over the years, it's kind of become much more than that. It can generate like CI/CD pipelines now for your app, as long as it knows whether that app is like a monolith or microservices or a gateway. So those are the 3 app types we support. And then we added support for NoSQL databases as well as SQL databases. We have WebFlux in there. There's all kinds of stuff. So it's kind of like a choose your own adventure book, I like to say nowadays. I don't know if you all had those as kids like we did in the state, but I used to love them, right? It was like, choose this or this, and then you go to page 20 and then page 30 or whatever. And but it's a tool, right? You can see how to integrate different technologies. And so that's why I originally fell in love with it. I was an independent consultant at the time, and independent consultants, right, do things like this, right, to get marketing and get people to hire them for their services. And I would speak at conferences a lot, but at the same time, it was, it's costly to speak at a conference. You're not billing. You got to travel overseas, or you got to travel somewhere. And a lot of times the conferences would cover my costs, but they wouldn't pay my billing rate while I'm there. So I decided I'll write a book on JHipster. It seems pretty cool. And in the process of writing that book, I just discovered bugs, right? And so I contributed PRs, or I made issues. And so I became, a member of the project. And that's been like 6 years now. I did not invent it, right? I'm not a founder. It was years in production before I became a part of it. The funny thing is, because I dress up in the outfit when I do talks, like, I've even had coworkers that thought I created JHipster, right? They're like, you're the JHipster guy. And I'm like, no, I just know how to dress up, So it's a thriving open source project started by Julien Dubois, who lives in Paris, on October 21st, 2013. His original commit message was hipster stack for Java developers, Yeoman, Maven, Spring, and AngularJS in one handy generator. The first publicly release was in December of 2017, or 2013, and it's grown quite a bit since then. You might notice that Spring Boot wasn't released until March of 2014, right? So in the beginning, there was no Spring Boot, and then we kind of hopped on that bandwagon, and it was pretty easy to convert, like, not only with JHipster, but I was at a client at the time called MedAmerica out in California, and they had a Spring MVC app, and they wanted to use the externalized configuration that Spring Boot provides, where you can use, environment variables or properties files like outside of the jar, outside of the war. They were just intrigued by that whole idea. And I converted their Spring MVC app to Spring Boot in like a day, right? So it wasn't terribly difficult. So saying that, JHipster adopted Spring Boot isn't really saying much. It's like someone spent a few hours and did it, And since then, we've grown quite a bit. We had 2 million downloads in 2020. So a lot of people are using it, or at least generating apps with it, right? And then so far this year, we've had 1.1 million. So we're not through the year yet, but we average about 123,000 per month.
Walmart Labs has been pretty amazing because it's important for us to let the world know that we're reinventing ourselves all the time.
Building a seamless customer experience is the #1 thing that we've been focused on.
We experiment, we try new things.
How do you get an organization this size to move at a much faster pace?
Walmart is doing that in a courageous way.
No longer do we think about, a store or an e-commerce. We think about the customer.
We're bringing not just technology, we're bringing design, empathy, emotion into the future of retail.
Walmart's definitely in the war for talent.
To bring data analytics,
Data scientists, engineers,
Top-notch technologists.
into how we serve customers in a better way.
And we need them to recognize that we are a career destination. And
Our new website, this new branding, is all about
the electricity, the charge that we have to build great products for the world's largest company.
it's setting a new tone.
that the work they do here can have a big impact.
We're just getting started.
$1,000 per month. And to use it, you can use npm install, and you might be like, hey Matt, this is supposed to be for Java hipsters. Why are we using npm? So this is just one way to create an app with JHipster. You can install npm, you can do it that way, but then once it's like in GitHub or GitLab, wherever you put it, a Java developer could clone that repo and they don't need npm installed on their system, and it will like install it to build like the Angular front end or the React front end or whatever it is, and operate it all from Maven or Gradle. So that was the whole impetus behind it in the beginning when Julian created it. I think it was Ant at the time, and they wanted a way to call Node from Ant, and so that's why he created like the whole thing. And so then you can create a directory and CD into it. If you're a Java developer, typically this is kind of foreign, right? When we create apps with like Maven archetypes or whatever, it creates a directory, then it puts the files into it, right? And in the Node ecosystem, they do things different. So if you don't create the directory and you like open up a terminal, you put a bunch of files in your home directory, and it's your worst mistake, right? You're like, what's in there? What do I delete, right? And so make sure you create a directory and CD into it. If you haven't used the take command before, it's pretty cool because it does both of those. So if you're using like omyzsh, it's in there by default. I think if you're just using zsh on a Mac, it's not in there. You might have to install it, and I don't know if Bash has it either. But then you just run JHipster, and it'll prompt you for a whole bunch of options. It'll prompt you if you want a monolith, a gateway, or a microservice, Spring MVC or Spring Webflux, the authentication type, whether it's JWT or OAuth 2 with OpenID Connect, or just doing plain old sessions. So a lot of those choices will depend on the type of app you're creating. If you're doing microservices, it's not going to give you the session option because the sessions aren't shared between the microservices, right? It'll just give you JWT or OAuth 2. And then the database type, whether you want to do NoSQL or SQL, and then the build tool, Maven or Gradle. There's not any other ones I know of in the Java space yet. And then the web framework, which back in the day might have been like Struts or Spring MVC, right? That's what I had in AppFuse. But these days, it's Angular, React, or Vue. Those are the three we support, and there are others supported, but I'll get to that towards the end. So the CLI works pretty well if you're just developing a single app, right? Because you're doing a monolith, and then you can even generate entities using the CLI. But if you're doing microservices, maybe you want to generate 10 apps, right? One gateway and 10 apps. So it can be kind of tedious to use the CLI to do that for each one. There's also JHipster Online, so similar to start.spring.io. We have start.jhipster.tech, and the reason we ask you to log in is so you could actually save like your JDL designs. I'll get to what those are in a minute, and push your project to something like GitHub or GitLab. So you're just configuring settings so you can push out to other places. And it's good for single apps too, but again, if you're going to use this to do multiple apps, it's going to be kind of a pain. So JDL is what we recommend for doing multiple apps. I realize that font's a little hard to read. I think it's an image though, so I don't know if I can make it bigger. Nope. But basically JDL stands for JHipster Domain Language. That's how we know we're hip. We have our own domain language, right? So it was one of the first things created for JHipster, and it kind of is the foundation of it. And up in the corner there, it has an application, block, and then in it has a config, and it says the base name is gateway, reactive is true, so that means it's going to use Spring Web Flux. It defines a package name, it defines the authentication type, and if you're doing microservices, you're going to want that authentication type to match, right, between them all, or that's going to be weird. It's just not going to work. We might let you do it, right, but things are going to not work when you try to make them talk to each other. It uses Gradle in this example. It uses Vue on the front end, and then Postgres for the database. And since I didn't define a development database, it'll use H2, right, just for running it locally. And then a service discovery type is Eureka. So this JDL is what I use to do that reactive microservices blog post that I mentioned earlier. It's got basically a gateway in the front, and then it's got a blog, and the blog has 3 entities. It's got, the blog itself, posts, and then tags, right? Things you might need for a blog. And then it's also got a store where it's just got products. So I was trying to, develop a simple microservices architecture that you probably shouldn't use microservices for because it's so small, right? But again, it's just an example. So, this is the gateway, the blog there, and then there's a store that you don't see on here. But there's also at the bottom of each of those blocks, they've got the entities. So in the gateway, it says entities, blog, post, tag, and product. So it's got all the entities in there. And then if you look at the blog one, it's got entities, blog, post, and tag, and then the store one would just have product. Well, how it works and how it pulls it all together is it puts the UI all on the gateway. And so this is kind of a weird thing from microservices perspective because they're supposed to be independent deployable units, right? And if you change the microservice that somehow influenced the UI, then you're going to have to deploy the gateway. And so it took me a while with JHipster to be like, hey, maybe we're doing it wrong, right? In the beginning, I was like, oh, look, it's all great. And I think for the most part, people that are doing microservices with JHipster just didn't have a client, right? There was no UI, so it worked great. They never had to worry about that tight coupling on the UI. So another important part of microservices architectures are Docker and Kubernetes. So in addition to supporting these, JHipster also supports Consul or Eureka for service discovery. So we have been using Eureka servers for several years, right? That's from Netflix. And we noticed that it just isn't very maintained. Like it is maintained, but no innovation, not a lot going on in that project. So for the next version, the major version of version 8, we're going to switch to Consul from HashiCorp. And, if that doesn't work, you can always switch back, right? It's just the default choice. And what we find with the project is a lot of times the default choice is what people pick. So that's why it's a big deal, right? Otherwise, we probably wouldn't care. And it's got CI/CD, so if you want to do, Circle CI, if you want to do GitHub Actions, if you want to do Jenkins, you just run JHipster CI/CD, and then it'll prompt you for those choices and generate those scripts for you. So that's pretty handy too. And if you're into UI testing, Cypress is a great tool for that. We generate the Cypress tests for you. We used to do Protractor, but we spent so much time debugging the flaky Protractor tests in GitHub Actions that there were some people that were just like, I want to never touch this tool again, right? And then you'd run it locally and everything works and you'd be like, this is great. But Cypress has been so much more stable for us. It's really been a much nicer tool for that. So the microservices architecture that we developed by default with JHipster has that one major flaw I talked about where everything is on the gateway. So in this instance, the left side is the service discovery stuff, and then the gateway is kind of where everything sits. And we did have to migrate to Spring Cloud Gateway when I think it was Spring Boot 2.6 because they stopped supporting Zool. We were using Zool at the time from Netflix, and Zool 1 is blocking. Right? It's not reactive, it's not non-blocking. So they came out with Zool 2, and they basically said, we're going to be non-blocking, and you should use this. And the Spring Cloud guys said, no thanks, we're going to write our own. So they wrote Spring Cloud Gateway as a substitution for something like Zool that does routing between the services and all that. And so we were somewhat forced, because we're a Spring project, to adopt Spring Cloud Gateway just because it would be weird for us to try to bring in Zool 2 with Spring Cloud and all that kind of stuff. They have had a fair amount of demand for a Spring MVC version of it, that's not reactive. So that could be coming in the future. There is an actual issue out there you can go and vote on. But you know, this has a beautiful like microservices backend, but all of the UI for those microservices is on the front end. It's in that Angular app, right? So that's like, ew, that's kind of gross. And for the most part, like I would happily talk to you probably a few years ago before micro front ends, before I knew about them, and I would be happy and be like, this is awesome. But when I learned about micro front ends, I was like, oh man, we're totally doing it wrong. Like we need to adopt that as fast as possible so people can deploy the microservice as a standalone unit, right? And so if you were to take this same graph, and I'm using React here just because I wanted different colors, but the shell will actually sit on the gateway, and then all the functionality is pulled in from the microservices at runtime. So it's very similar to how backends use HTTP or gRPC to communicate. This uses HTTP to load the remote code from the various microservices. So a lot of what you'll see with micro front ends is talking about the front end code doing it, and it's the JavaScript ecosystem that's, you know, doing most of it, but they're also doing it like with their node backends, right? Because it's just JavaScript, so they can load remote code into their backends as well. And so you might not have heard of it before. How many people have heard of micro front ends before tonight? We got a little more than half the room, so that's good. But basically, one of the well-known implementations is Webpack's Module Federation, right? It was invented by this guy, Zach. I got his name on the next slide. Hopefully he's not watching. Sorry, I forgot your last name, Zach. But he did a lot of the implementation in Webpack to do the Module Federation.
Let's face it, with traditional recruitment agency models, you're exposed. If a candidate leaves any time during the first 12 months, you and your team will experience major pain. That's why at Stack & Co. we've created a win-win risk-sharing hiring model where we share the risk with you for the first 12 months and allow you to spread your hiring budget out over that time period. Furthermore, in the unlikely event of a Stack & Co. candidate leaving any time during the 12 months, the payment obligation stops. Being software recruitment experts, we'll introduce you to the best engineering talent available in Ireland today. Reach out to me, Jerry Nolan, for more information via our website, stack&.co.
And so, similar to microservices, there was a micro front ends blog post on Martin Fowler's blog by Cam Jackson in June of 2019. So this is still quite a while ago, but it was saying, you know, you should look into this. And there was a number of different implementations. I think Single Spa is one of them. If you just Google for micro front ends, there's like 5, you know, major sites that have been talking about micro front ends for quite some time. So have you heard of ThoughtWorks Radar? Right? So in November 2016 is when micro front ends first appeared on that. So that's been like 6 years ago, and it was like, assess, right? Take a look at them. And it wasn't until 2017, November, that they were like, trial them. And then 2019, in April, they were like, adopt. So it's been about 2.5 years. And November 2019, it was still in adopt. And what they witnessed by customers that were using them was there was smaller, more cohesive and maintainable code bases. There was more scalable organizations with the decoupled teams, right? It wasn't just all the UI developers working together. And the ability to upgrade, update, or even rewrite parts of the front end in a more incremental fashion than was previously possible before. So what they saw a lot of was actually people that had big Angular apps and they wanted to move to React, right? But rewriting the whole thing is like a big pain, right? And there's not much ROI. So they were like, let's just take this section or this portion of the page and do that in React. And what I've seen, Comcast is a big cable company in the US. A lot of what they've done with micro front ends is make it so it's all React, but they're kind of separate pages, right? Like they aren't separate bits on the screen, right? Like you could see if you were looking at a shopping cart that the shopping cart might be a micro front end and, you know, the product display might be a micro front end, stuff like that. Comcast was just like the whole page is a different micro front end. So, you know, that's one way to do it. Another thing I've seen is Nokia actually was doing a lot of static generation of their products, but then the actual shopping cart was like a micro front end within those products, right? So they do a bunch of static generation and, you know, plop in some JavaScript code to do the actual purchasing of the product. So, at the end they said basically, we have confidence this style will grow in popularity as larger organizations try to decompose UI development across multiple teams. So it's getting away from, having the UI team and getting people to be able to be a part of the other team. So this is just one example where, you're able to store them in separate, source controls. You build and test them separately, and then in production they're kind of composed together. And that's what JHipster does at the same time. And so we do things a little bit different, but the cool thing is they've actually, so Zach Jackson is the creator of Module Federation from Webpack. He recently collaborated with Manfred Steyer to create Native Federation. And so this means you can use micro front-end concepts with any build tool. You're still talking JavaScript build tools, right? They didn't add Maven support or anything like that, right? But it works with like ESM build and other JavaScript build tools. So it can kind of happen in the browser more than requiring your build tool to do it. So I think that's pretty exciting. You can see here, this is from August 29th. So just last month, where they kind of got all that working. And then you might be saying, well, I'm a Java developer, like, why should I care, right? And I think personally that micro front ends are a fascinating architectural concept. So I'm going to put on my bow tie here. And I like it because they basically weave everything together, just like on the back end, everything's weaved together with gRPC or HTTP. And with micro front ends, it's all HTTP. So the cool thing is, like, in your browser, you can open up your developer console and see the micro front ends being loaded from, another remote endpoint. And it's just cool. So I've encountered quite a few, monolith UIs in my time as a consultant. And the back end was often just a beautiful, like, microservices architecture, right? But the front end is just like, this monolith. So there's a good chance that as a Java developer, you don't care about the UI because you don't work on it, right? You're one of the ones that works on that beautiful microservices architecture on the back end. However, if you consider yourself a Java web developer, which a lot of us were way back in 2005 because we did struts and Spring MVC and all that, like, I think it's as revolutionary as HTML5. Like, I think it's a pretty big deal. But again, microservices probably shouldn't use, right? So if you're using microservices, yeah, check out micro front ends, but I don't know if you need them if you're not, right? But Zach Johnson, or Zach, what's his name? Sorry, Zach Jackson. He basically he's in love with his own technology. So it's fun to follow him on Twitter because he's like, look at what we accomplished now. But they're doing a lot of it with server-side JavaScript frameworks. The ability to actually, on the edge and in Lambdas, like, communicate with each other and distribute new code without having to restart anything. And I agree, it's pretty cool. But at the same time, you can get into the same problem you have with microservices, where if you have 100 different apps, like, there's a lot going on to manage 100 different apps, right? Managing one app isn't that difficult. But when you're managing 100, like, how do you aggregate the logs? How do you get them, monitor them all and stuff like that? So he is building some cool tools around that as well. Demo, right? What I'm going to do in this demo is I'm going to create some apps using the JDL because we're doing microservices. So if I was doing it with the CLI or I was doing it with JHipster Online, it would just be tedious, right? You'd be like, he seems to be doing the same thing over and over. Then I'll run the apps just using Gradle because that's a build tool I'm going to use. And then I might do the end-to-end tests, we'll see. I'll run everything with Docker, and then I'll switch identity providers because by default we use Keycloak for our identity provider because then everything's locally contained and it can be in Docker. So when I first started working at Okta, I'd actually been acqui-hired from a company called Stormpath. So Stormpath I had worked for as a consultant because that was my gig for the most part. I was only full-time at LinkedIn because they were like, hey, we're going to IPO, you want some options? I was like, sure, I'll go full-time for a bit, right? But then the 2008 economy crash happened, and like the VCs that were invested in LinkedIn put out a presentation that was like, we recommend firing 10% of your people, right? And I remember when we got that phone call because I was running the Denver office and there was only like 5 of us working there. And they were like, we need all of y'all to come out to, you know, what was it, Mountain View next week, right? We have a meeting on Tuesday. And they never asked us all to come out before. And we were like, are you firing us? Because if you're firing us, can you just tell us and we'll save you a bunch of money? So we were like, what, 8, 9, and 10 or whatever at the company to know that this was all happening. So 2008 is kind of when, you know, I left LinkedIn. And, you know, I enjoyed the independent consulting thing because I have a name and, you know, people hire me for good money. And so I was working at Stormpath as a Java guy in the morning and Computer Associates as a JavaScript guy in the afternoon. And Stormpath basically came to me and said, you know, we want you to lead the Java effort and we want you to be like, you know, SDK lead as well as like somewhat of an evangelist. And I was like, I just like JavaScript too, right? I don't want to just be a Java guy. So they were like, okay, whatever. And we basically didn't talk for a month. And then I was like, okay, I'll turn this into my dream job. I want to do Java and JavaScript. I don't want to do development the whole time. I want to do, you know, developer evangelism. And the funny thing is evangelism, I don't know if you know this, like we no longer say that, right? We say advocacy. Because evangelism is very much preacher or religious based. And there's some countries that won't even let you in if you have evangelist in your title because they think it's religious, right? So developer advocate's a much better term because it's kind of two-way street, right? And how it works in a lot of my experiences, I've been doing it 5 years, is I'm customer zero, right? They do a new release of an SDK and I'm the first one to try it out and I find bugs and I tell them they need to fix them and then there's a dot release or whatever, right? So we're using all the tools, you know, in the beginning and, you know, switching identity providers, we'll switch to Okta. But what I wanted to tell you about that is when I first started with Okta, I'd worked there probably a month, there were no SDKs, right? Stormpath had a bunch of SDKs that we would use and it was fun to talk about because there was like a Spring Boot starter that did everything for you. And there was none at Okta, but they supported internet standards like SAML and OpenID Connect. How many people have used SAML? Oh, I'm so sorry. Like it's so bad, right? It's from like 2005, 2006. It was before we had smartphones. Like who's going and inventing like web services these days and using like, you know, SOAP? Nobody, right? And that's the equivalent. So if you're going to develop an identity system and base it on SAML, think to yourself, do I like SOAP? All right? Maybe you do. Maybe you're a dirty person. You need more SOAP in your life. But, you know, what I started to do then is implement OIDC and OAuth into JHipster. I had worked there for about 2 months and I was like, this is a pretty cool gig, but how do I talk about our SDKs if there aren't any? Right? And I was like, well, they support these standards, so let's see if I can make those standards work in JHipster. And to make Stormpath work in JHipster was pretty easy. I wrote a module, and I think I had it done in 3 days. But with Okta, what I found was that JHipster already had an OAuth implementation, but it was generating like the OAuth keys from inside the app. There was no outside provider. They just had endpoints that gave the tokens and stuff like that. And then on the client in Angular, they had a client ID, and a client secret. And what you never want to put in your JavaScript code is a client secret. So, you know, I'd worked on JHipster for a couple of years, but I'd never like explored OAuth. And I saw that gaping hole and I was like, I can't work for Okta and promote JHipster and not fix this, right? This is a real problem. So we made some key decisions at that time that I think are important to talk about because, you know, Keycloak was one of them, right? You don't want to make people sign up for Okta or Auth0 or Ping Identity or Microsoft Azure or something like that, right? You want them to be able to develop locally. So Keycloak has been a big part of our strategy, and it's worked great. And I would encourage you to use Keycloak if you're doing OAuth with JHipster because it works nice. But if you go to production, maybe you don't want to manage that, right? That's where Okta or Auth0 would come into play and make it a little easier for you. But it took about 6 months to integrate like OAuth support into JHipster. And one of the strategic decisions I made at the time and forced, and I still defend it to this day, is doing everything on the back end. So all of the redirects, all the OAuth dance and all that happens on the back end. So guess what? We don't do anything on the front end. If we did not do that decision, how you would have to do it is authentication on the front end, right? And you would have to have an OIDC library for Vue, one for React, one for Angular, and currently there's really only one for Angular. No one else is like taking the time to write one for Vue or React. So, you know, it's kind of a strategic decision that worked out well, and you'll see some of that going on when we actually do the demos. But it's super easy to switch between identity providers because you just have to configure Spring Boot, right? An issuer, a client ID, and a client secret. You switch those, it'll use a new identity provider, and you're off on your way. So I have this GitHub repo here, Auth0 micro frontends JHipster example. And this is what I learned from last night. This was my biggest thing. I had done the demo for about 20 minutes in, and when I tried to like compile it, what I realized is I've been trying to upgrade JHipster to Spring Boot 3. That's what I was using for everything. And so about halfway through the demo, I was like, oh, I'm using a nightly build. Don't do that. So I have it over here, and I just installed it right before we began, and we're using the latest version 7.9.3.
If you're exhausted before you even get to your desk, then check out tcube co-working space. Located at O'Connell Bridge in Dublin city centre means a maximum walk of just 3 minutes from over 100 Dublin bus routes, Dart Station and both Red and Green Lewis. And after a long day of code crunching, getting home or meeting friends for dinner is also a breeze. We offer a low-cost, no-frills model, which means you're not paying for free stuff that you'll never use. Tcube offers a range of flexible daytime and 24/7 options, meaning you can join our community of freelance and remote software developers from as low as €277 per month. And that includes VAT, coffee and 1 gigabit Wi-Fi. So if you're looking for a distraction-free workspace, which you can come to and then get out again to enjoy your life in the comfort of knowing that you've been at your most productive, then get in touch today for a free trial. Call us on 675-9777 or find out more online at tcubedublin.com.
So I also have this demo script in the repo. Here's the repo here, and demo.adoc. So if you want to do, this demo script yourself, you could. We'll put that on the left, and then I do like ASCII Doctor, so if I view it in raw, I have an ASCII Doctor plugin that makes it look a little better. And you'll see we need a couple of prerequisites, Java 11, Node 16, Docker Desktop, and JHipster 793. So before last night, I didn't have this step in there. Now I have it in there, so I make sure to switch to the latest version, and we'll clear this and then put it on the right, and we can start. I like to do everything in my downloads directory. There's another app in there, but I'll do take micro frontends JHipster. And this is also funny. There's so many different ways of spelling micro frontends, right? Microservices, we just do one word, right? Micro frontends, if you search for with a space in there, there's plenty of references there. With a dash, plenty there. Put them together, plenty there. And I did a Twitter poll, and no one could agree. Like it's 33% for each, right? So call it what you want. But then I'm going to download both the reactive MS JDL, that's a Webflux-based microservices, and then this reactive MF JDL that I created. So we'll run these two commands here to download it. And so let's just download those JDL files. And then we'll clear that, and we'll run idea diff. So if you're using IntelliJ, you can install a command line launcher. This has a link to it right there, and then the idea command will work. So you could do idea space, dot, and it'll open the current directory in idea, which is pretty cool. But we're just going to do reactive MS and reactive MF. Then it'll open up IntelliJ and show us the difference between them. So you can see here the gateway is pretty much the same, except I switched to React, right, instead of Vue. So in my previous example with doing the monolith UI, I used Vue because I was new to JHipster at the time. I also switched to console for service discovery, and that's because in JHipster 8, we're moving to console because, like I mentioned, Eureka isn't, it's maintained, but very lightly. And then instead of having the entities all in the gateway, we just say micro frontends and specify the microservices that have those micro frontends. And then for the microservices themselves, they do need to define the client framework that they're using. And if you have something like Cypress, you'll need to include that. So this, service discovery type isn't really relevant for this, but the client framework and the test framework is. And everything else is kind of the same. I did add some more stuff down at the bottom. So like I said, JHipster, we call it a platform because we try to be fancy, but it's got the ability to generate Docker Compose files, so you can start everything up in Docker, as well as deploy it with Kubernetes. So it generates all the files you need for Kubernetes to deploy it. So I just added these definitions in there so you could kind of see what they look like. And then we'll use this for Docker Compose, but with Kubernetes, I've found that running it on Minikube locally, I haven't been as successful as if I deploy it to Google Cloud, like it works right away. And I think a lot of that is like the M1, right? I'm on a new architecture, I'm Apple Silicon. Like it's been a struggle to get everything to work nicely, right? This is one of the few trips that I haven't brought like the Intel laptop with me to be like, there's my backup plan, So that's what it looks like. And now what I would ask is, what web framework do you want to use? Because in the description for this talk, it says Angular, and I have an Angular tattoo. But what we found in Cork was React was the most popular. So let's start from the top. Who wants to use Angular? We got like 3. Who wants to use React? We got most of the room. And Vue. We got 1. All right. So we did specify React in this JDL, so we can stick with that. I also wanted to point out what you saw in that screen was the JHipster JDL plugin. So if I was to open this up in IntelliJ, I have already had the JDL plugin installed, and this guy has written it, and he basically releases like a new version every week. He's super awesome. So you'll see there's actually like a little bow tie and suit code on there, but he's made it so these are all code completion there. Right, so you can get all the values in there, and then this button over here, you can click it and generate the whole thing. So I'm not going to do it through IntelliJ, or why not, right? You chose React, we can do it that way. So you just click that, and it goes and generates, all the different projects. Oh wait, here's why I didn't want to do that. That's good to know. There's a couple other options I wanted to specify. So the cool thing is, you can just delete blog, Docker Compose. You could also override them, gateway, Kubernetes, and store. And since it didn't do npm install, right, it didn't take a long time to delete those because the npm install will really complicate things. So I wanted to use my demo script here because I had a few different options, and that was the mono repo and the workspaces. So you can see I'm just doing JDL, reactive mf JDL. It's talking to that file locally, but there's also JDL samples. So we have a whole bunch up here on GitHub, and you'll notice that reactive mf is actually in here, down at the bottom. And so if I just type JDL reactive mf, it will default to this repo and download them, right? And so you don't actually have to have the files locally if you're just doing a demo or something like that or want to show people. So that's that. And then -- mono repository is because for demo purposes only pretty much, because if I took everything that we generated today and pushed it to a GitHub repo, by default, without specifying mono repo, every project is a GitHub project or a Git project, right? So you end up with like the sub project kind of thing, and it doesn't push everything up and all that, and so it's weird. So specifying this, it just assumes it's all in the same project. And then workspaces is an npm concept. It's similar to a POM file that has an aggregator, right? So you can run one command and it runs through all your projects. So the same thing with workspaces. It's actually very easy to configure. You go into a parent package.json and you go into a child one, you link them together, and then you're good to go. So if I run that, it'll go ahead and generate everything for us. And it will do an install, and if you did want to skip the npm install, you could do what's called -- skip install as the flag for that. But while that's going, we can open it up in IntelliJ, and hopefully there won't be too much indexing, right? That's the worst part about IntelliJ when you're doing demos. Like, you don't really notice it during the day, but you're doing demos like this and you're generating 30,000 lines of code, it's like, I got to index all of it.
Today's unprecedented demand for broadband has accelerated the pace of fiber network deployment. Network engineers know that innovative modern planning is the key to delivering this growth. Synchronoss offers a leading platform for end-to-end fiber network design and planning. Spatial Suite excels at handling accurate and up-to-date network data. This decreases cycle time, reduces costs, and enhances efficiency. Why choose Spatial Suite for fiber network design and planning? Spatial Suite excels with complex fiber networks. Our fiber-optimized tools accelerate planning by generating multiple scenarios to find the most optimal solution. Seamless integration of inside plant racked equipment with outside plant systems provides an end-to-end view of the network. And our mobile field access saves time, improves collaboration, and reduces errors. Now more than ever, flexibility in deployment environments is fundamental. The Synchronoss Spatial Suite platform can be deployed on premises, as a Synchronoss cloud-hosted solution, or as a customer-hosted managed service. Spatial Suite has supported service providers worldwide for 25 years. This depth of experience gives Synchronoss an unprecedented grasp on network planning needs, improving your team's efficiency in the office and the field. Leading fiber customers rely on Spatial Suite to deliver results. They know Synchronoss will ensure they meet their ever-increasing data network needs, now and in the years to come.
Like, do you have to? But one of the cool things about the workspaces concept is there is only one node modules. So it's in the parent versus if you were doing them all, in their own repo, which you probably want to do, right? They would all be in the sub-repos and you would have like a duplication among dependencies. So if we were to look at the gateway, for instance, to start, source main Java, which you're all probably used to. The other thing we can do here is make this into a Maven project or a Gradle project. So build.gradle, and then link Gradle project, and then it'll give us a little syntax highlighting and all that. But there has been talk about doing like feature-based packages, right? You'll notice here it's like domain, repository, and then like the web APIs under web REST, right? And you've seen people be like, it should be account, and then everything's kind of nested under there. There is another JHipster project called JHipster Lite that's doing that. For the most part, we've been like, well, it's a pretty easy refactor if you want to refactor, right? So that's why we've kind of left it. And actually, I think someone might have developed it. It's just one of those flags that you would specify in the JDL or whatnot. So that actually might be there. So the other thing I wanted to show you is under web app, right, is where the full client is. And index.ts kind of is the, the meat of the React app that kind of pulls everything together. And then there's like configuration under here for Axios. The entities, which we don't have any because we haven't generated any for the gateway. And then there's modules under here for administration and some shared modules for authentication and stuff like that. And then micro frontends is right here, and these pull in from the other projects, right? So that's why they're empty. The entities menu and routes menu, that's all they really need to get from the other project. And then when you click on stuff, it actually goes to the other project. And then under Webpack, there's Webpack micro frontends. This is like the meat of the module federation stuff. So you can see here, it just pulls in that package JSON, and then it uses this module federation plugin, and those remotes are where it gets its data from, right? So it's just got two defined here, and then this is basically looping through that package JSON and sharing all the dependencies between them. And then there's some things in the app that it shares between the apps as well. And that's the gateway that pulls those in. And then if we were to look at, for instance, the blog down here, when we were to look at Webpack as well, close these, you can see that it basically exposes the entities menu, which has the menu items for, blog, post, and tag, as well as the routes. And, that's just a word wrap there. That's why it looks kind of funny. And it shares all those similar things. So if you were actually, developing a monolith UI and you didn't specify micro frontends, in this blog micro frontend, you would have source main, Docker, Java, and resources, but there would be no web app, right? Because there was no web app when you're doing a monolith UI. That's all on the gateway. So let's check back here, see if we're done. Looks like we are. So it took about 2 minutes, 21 seconds. go back to our instructions, make sure I didn't miss anything. So if you did want to override that JDL, there is a way to do it, passing in -- client - framework. So you can override those defaults that are in there where it specifies React. The only reason we have Angular X here is because back in the day, it was Angular JS and Angular 2. And then I don't know if you remember, they skipped Angular 3. They were like, we're going to do Angular 4. And then there was so much going on that we're like, can we just call it Angular X? And then I think 6 months later, someone from the Angular team was like, it's just Angular. Stop calling it, 4 or JS or whatever. And so it was too late by that time. We had to maintain backwards compatibility. So in the next version, we're removing the X. So you could just specify Angular. But next, we'll CD into the gateway there. And we need to start some Docker containers, right? Because we do depend on those. So Docker PS. We have Keycloak running, so I'll just stop that one and make sure nothing else is running. And then we'll do Docker compose -f source main Docker Keycloak up -d. And so I do have a shortcut for that. If you're familiar with OMyZSH, they have plugins. So I can do JH Keycloak up is one of the JHipster plugins that we provide for OMyZSH. So you can just type that. The cool thing is you can also do JH Keycloak logs and then see the logs from that Docker container. And they're just alias that go in your ZSH file. And then we can also start up console. So I can use JH console up for that. And then we'll look at both of those, Docker PS, make sure they're started. And then we'll run Gradle here. And we do configure like default, tasks or default goals in Maven. That's one of those things that I tried to convince the Spring Boot guys. I was like, can you make Spring Boot run like the default? And they were like, nope, a lot of people do compile as a default, so we're not going to make it the default. But you can configure your build files to have a default so you don't have to spell out, the whole thing each time. And this will actually download and install Node if you don't have it installed, as well as NPM. So it's all operating, from Gradle. And then there's also this. You can tell that Marcelo is a JavaScript guy because he's like, I'm not typing Gradle, I'm typing npm app start, right? And so, it's similar to Ant in the sense that you can define all these tasks. They're just alias for other tasks, right? So if you look at the package.json, it's got a bunch of those in there.
In 2019, there were more than 5,000 data breaches. With Oracle Security, not only does it offer you greater agility, flexibility, and scalability, it also puts security first. Security that's automated, always on, and architected in, protecting data throughout its lifecycle and across the full stack. That's Oracle Security.
So if we open this up at 8080, then we can log in with Keycloak, and we just use admin or user, and then we're logged in, and Chrome is like, hey, stop using admin, right? That's what they're doing right here, so good on them. And then it tries to save it, which is funny. But error loading component, right? Those are the microservices or the micro front ends downstream. So if we were to open this up and refresh, you can see at the top there's 404s for those, right? Nothing's running, but our React implementation is pretty nice in that you can see there's an error there. Maybe you don't want that, right? Maybe you want just fail gracefully or whatever. So if you use Angular and Vue, you will see something in your console here, but nothing will show up here. So I think it was just React offered us more of the ability to catch that error and display it, and we didn't do it with the other ones. So now we'll start up the blog. So we can resolve that, and we'll just start it up with Gradle, but also it relies on a Docker container too. So back here I have a command that you can use to run any of the databases. So npm run, docker :db up, which is still like almost as hard to remember as that, right? But I have a shortcut for it, so I do alias run, and it's npm run ci e2e prepare. So that's what I do a lot of times to start the dependent Docker containers. So if we do Docker PS, we should see Neo4j in there. We do. So now we can start it up with Gradle. And then we'll do the store as well. And the store uses MongoDB, so JH MongoDB up, or Mongo up. And you can imagine that if you're on a 16 gigabyte MacBook Pro, it might be struggling right now, right? But I'm on an M1, so like this is easy peasy. But also, it's a lot about your Docker settings. So I think they're under here, resources. You can see I have 8 CPUs set up and 48 gigs of memory, right? So if you actually did this with the default settings, I think it's like 2 CPUs and like 4 gigs or something small like that. Like things struggle to start up because you end up having like 15 containers going with all the databases and everything. I think this will show us here 5 containers so far. So they're still like starting up, right? And it's also just the ancillary containers, right? Our apps aren't actually Dockerized yet, right? We're just running them via Gradle. So we can go and look at like console 8500 is where that's at. And it has all of our services up, right? So if we were to, refresh this, we don't get any 404s in there, and these are working, right? So we could say, here, create a new blog, call it Matt's blog, handle is Matt, and the user will just assign it to that admin user, and then save it. That's all working. If we went into products, we could create a new beer product, and they're about 10 euros these days, and then I'll put this beer in there. So you can see everything's working, right? All the microservices are talking to each other, and you could even run from the top level, npm run e2e and use Cypress. And because we're using workspaces, what it'll do is all those tests are actually contained in each service, but it'll run them, for all of them and kind of aggregate them all together. So I'll just do that because it's kind of fun to watch. And it used to be super slow. Like Cypress on an M1 was like painfully slow, and you were like, what's wrong? Cypress is supposed to be fast. And so only in the last couple of releases did they make it so it works fast on an M1 as well. And you can see like it's not painful to run at all. And you can use it in CI, and you can do it headless, or you can install Chrome on your server and do it that way as well. But it's a great way to just know you didn't break anything, right? And so all these tests are generated for you, as well as unit tests that test like without running it in the browser. And we also have Sonar as a Docker container. So if you want, you can start up Sonar and actually send all the results of your tests to that and see what your test coverage looks like. And so this is just restarting for each microservice that it talks to, so that's why there's a few different starts and stops there. So you can see everything passed. So we'll exit out of there and look at the next steps here. We looked at console, we saw the menu items. Oh, this is the part that the demo failed last night because I had generated it, and then as everything like failed, I was like, oh, I'll just switch to the example that I already have that works, right? Well, what I never did is I never switched IntelliJ to the new example. So I'm running it, everything's working from the running perspective. I'm editing the code and trying to show people the zero turnaround and the live, browser sync kind of stuff, and nothing's happening, right? I'm like, this totally worked last week when I tried it. Sorry, I don't know what's wrong. So the cool thing is you can go into the gateway here, right? We're still in the gateway directory. We can do npm start, and this will run a local Webpack server, and it'll do browser sync for everything. So now, if we were to go into the gateway and look for home.tsx, everything's TypeScript. We've got to make sure we get the right project, right? We're in gateway here. And then we just go down here. And after this H2, maybe add an H3. And try to get my HTML correct. And we say like, hello world.
Partnering with Amazon Web Services, Global Payments is transforming our issuer platform to deliver innovative payment solutions at scale in a secure cloud-based environment. From enterprises to small and mid-sized banks, and from new fintech entrants to embedded payment service providers, we are bringing world-class capabilities like program management and banking as a service to new markets globally. At Global Payments, our unparalleled legacy of reliability, performance, and experience, combined with AWS's cloud leadership, will meet the increasing demand of a connected digital world. That's Global Payments. That's innovation that delivers.
And we save it and we go back, it's already there, right? So that was pretty quick. And then if we get this class name here and go back, add it there so we see it a little better. I can't even switch back fast enough so you saw it happen, right? So it's very quick turnaround on the UI to make those changes. And then the cool thing is if we were to go to our blog microservice, right? We make sure it says blog there, and you do npm start, it will start it as well and allow you the same thing on that micro front end, right? So you'll notice it says blog up here. It's got a different person just because we calculate the icon it shows based on the name of the project. But the entities are just for that micro front end, right? And the microservice, so it doesn't contain those other ones. And if we were to go to, look at the posts here and then, change it, what was my example here? It was in that product directory to give it a background info. So, it was the store microservice. So, we'll do the blog. It'll go to like blog tsx, and we'll just make it so this div has that class name. I'll go back, and I don't think it should have reloaded that, right? Oh, we did blog, didn't we? Right, so there it is. And then if we went to the gateway and went to blog, it wouldn't, right? Because this is still like, it's not doing its own front end reload, right? That's only down, and it's on a different port, right? This is on 9000, and this one's on 9002. So it's doing Webpack for different micro front ends. And how we've set it up is you do have to have the gateway running. So if I was to go here and actually shut down the gateway, these wouldn't work. Right, and so that's the only requirement we have, and a lot of that was because OAuth and OIDC require you have redirect URIs specified in your server. In this case, it's Keycloak, right? And having to go in and specify each of those redirect URIs, port 9000, 9001, 9002, right? That's not very dynamic, right? So we're like, if we just keep, the gateway running, we know there's only two possible ports, 8080 and 9000, right? You can change them, but it was just an easier implementation for us. And, they still have some shells, but I think it's quite nice. And, worst case, you got to run a gateway and you got to run your micro front end and your microservice, but it's not terribly difficult. So let's just make sure we've seen everything that I was showing to. We looked at those micro front end files. Oh, and then we wanted to build it and run it with Docker. So shut down everything and clear them. Or exit. And then you can do npm run java docker. That will work if you're on an Intel or you're on Linux or you're on Windows or whatever, but with good old Apple Silicon, you have to add this little command here, the ARM64. Otherwise, it won't actually build it. So the cool thing is you can actually do this from the top level because of the npm workspaces. Right? And so it'll do it for all those different projects. So that's kind of a handy thing, right? As I said, mostly for demos, like if you want to do true microservices, right, you probably don't want any coupling between them. But if you're deploying everything in the same monorepo, like maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe it's just a convenience thing you can use. I also got the M1 because of Spring Native. Has anyone played with Spring Native and GraalVM? So you thought TypeScript took a while to compile. Like to take a Spring Boot app and compile it into like Spring Native is like 3 or 4 minutes, right? So it does take a while. And I basically told my boss at the time, I was like, half of my time can be saved if you just get me an M1 because it'll make all those Spring builds faster. And it's worked out pretty well. So it says everything seems to have worked. So now we can go into Docker Compose, which is a directory, right, that it created based on that Docker information. And we can do Docker stop or dstop because I have all those other containers running and there'll be conflicts, right? Things won't start up. It's not smart enough to know that if it's already running, let it run. And so we'll just stop all those. And then since you've already seen Keycloak, I'm going to go ahead and elaborate on this. And I'm going to just open up this directory. And in here, there's this application YAML that basically is shared between all the microservices, right? And so what I can do is I can switch identity providers just by basically copying this data from in here. I'll just use TextEdit because it loads the fastest. And then I'll replace this with the JHipster audience, which Auth0 needs. If you're using Okta, we've hard-coded Keycloak and Okta to use the same audience, which is API://default. So that's why you don't have to specify it with those two, but with Auth0 you do. And then this is just the long way of configuring Spring Security. Right? If it was properties, it'd be simpler, but it's still a long property name, right? But That's because Spring Security has so many different options, but we're just specifying an issuer here, and then a client ID and a client secret, and I've already configured this on Auth0. So if you wanted to see what that looks like, Auth0 apps open, you can run that, and then it'll prompt you for your apps, and I can open up this Micro Frontends one, and log in with GitHub, and then, oh, I'm using a new profile. This is a bad idea, Matt, but we'll see. You can see how good my 1Password is. Oh, now you gotta use the phone. How many people use two-factor authentication? All right, well, this is just part of the problem, right? But the GitHub app works pretty good for this most of the time. Time. We'll see if it does today. Come on. Meh. Well, I won't show you what Auth0 looks like because that's not really important because we've configured it, right? And everything should work. So if we were right here, we could do docker compose up, right? And you can do it with or without a space, right? The new version 2 is without a space, so we're using that here. There's also some things that are kind of painful happening here. You'll notice I didn't specify a -d, right? Because I like to look at all the colored logs like next to each other. But also, some of these, I'll be able to open it up in Docker here. And you'll see they're waiting for each other to start. So if we were to go to like the gateway and look at the logs, this application will start in 60 seconds. That is an awful demo, right? Like you aren't even going to try for 60 seconds, right? This is an M1. Like things could be up and running in 10. Right? Why do I have to sit here and wait for 60 seconds? So I did enter an issue, and JHipster like last week when I was practicing this, and I said, hey, you know, isn't the whole point of like microservices and Spring Boot and Spring Actuator like health checks, right? Can't we like ping the server and see it's up and then start it? And so basically Marcelo, one of the leads on the project, is basically like, yes, but that's a Docker Compose 2 thing, right? And so we aren't migrated to that yet. So in the next version, we'll have that ability, and hopefully demos like this will just start faster. But you can also go to like, you know, localhost 8500 console and see if things are started, right? And you see console started, the blog instance is started. Now we have the store that started, and the gateway is still, you know, back there waiting 60 seconds, right? And so, you know, it's one of those things that we used to do with Protractor all the time, right? You just wait, right, and hope the element's available when the... Keep trying. Right, keep going. You just restart that GitHub action, right? You're like, it'll work this time. Well, so now the gateway's up, right? So we could do localhost 8080. And I have learned that this can be dangerous because we've already logged into Keycloak, so it's possible there's like, you know, a token that's already on my browser. So I try to do, when I switch providers to another one, use, you know, incognito. And then you'll see here where, you know, prompted for email. It already configures Google by default, so that's kind of cool. But you'll also notice up here there's a warning, because how they did this to make it look so easy is they registered an app on Google and configured it in here, and then everyone who gets a new Auth0 account like has that same app configured. So they're like, we did this for convenience, but if you're going to actually use Google login, like go to Google, register your own app, right? Don't use ours, because it says something in here. Yeah, one or more your connections are using development keys. So then I got to remember my 1Password. There it is. And then just enter my credentials. This is usually the hardest part of the demo, because if you get it wrong, there's like no going back. You're like, sorry, that didn't work, right? So then you can see it comes back. Now it has a different username. And all our data, if we had entered it in, it's still there, right? And you can see our UI is still there because we're still using those same Docker containers that have that database. So we could delete it just to prove it works. And if we wanted to run Cypress tests, we could as well. We would just have to export a couple Cypress E2E username and Cypress E2E passwords, and then put our Auth0 credentials in there. But at the same time, like you're paying someone like Okta or Auth0 to manage your identity, you probably shouldn't be testing against them because they're going to charge you, right? Or you're going to hit rate limits or something like that. So test on Keycloak, right? And then just switch in production, or test on a nightly build with that. Then we'll go back here. I think that's most of it. Oh, the one thing I did want to mention, if you're using Docker with Keycloak, you do have to enter something in your host file. And that's because a lot of times Docker containers communicate with each other based on like a logical name on the Docker network, right? And it's like blog neo4j is like an example name. Well, Keycloak gets put in the browser when they redirect back to you. So most of the things don't really happen in a browser, right? They're just local host or whatever. But for the services to communicate with Keycloak, we had to use a logical name, which is Keycloak. And so we couldn't figure out a way to redirect to you and use localhost and override that. So the only solution we have for now is modifying your etc hosts. And then, of course, you can run those tests. This is all that you have to do to set up Auth0. Like I showed it all working, right? You have to go and create an application. You have to set up these callback URLs. And typically, it'll say code / like Okta or Auth0 or GitHub or whoever your provider is. The reason we use OIDC here is because Spring Security lets you. And we want to be able to switch between different providers without changing property names, right? So that was just a decision we made there. You have to create new roles, role admin and role user, because JHipster expects those. If you don't have the role user, you can't actually view any entities. And then you have to go in and create a new action that adds the preferred username and the roles to custom claims within your identity token that comes back to the user. And then Spring Security is smart enough to read those tokens and create like the granted authorities and all that kind of stuff that it uses on the back end. And so there's just a little bit of setup there. And then, of course, you saw this part. And then what I like to recommend is, stuck mouse. It's not my phone. Did you notice that if you use like the web browser for Facebook on your phone, it's like the worst experience ever? Like the apps are pretty good, right? But if you pull it up on your phone and like scroll through pictures, it's super janky. Like it's the worst story for React ever, where you're like, I'm going to stop using this app. So if you're having a problem with using Facebook too much, uninstall the app and just use your browser, because you'll be like, this isn't worth my time. So I think it's probably because we have all these Docker containers running. That's why things are slow, right? It's using all that memory. So I'll stop those. But you can see, I guess I didn't put a link to it, but the cool thing is with the Okta CLI, we made it so all you need to run is this to do all those steps, to configure the roles, to configure the groups claim, to create the app, to get the client ID and client secret. So I did enter an issue in Auth0 CLI to be like, hey, if you guys could fix this, that'd be great. So I think that's Auth0-CLI issue 351. We'll see if I remember it well. Yep, add support for JHipster. So if you're an Auth0 user and you want to do cool demos, then you should go vote for this. We got like 26 votes so far. So works pretty nice. And then make sure we got everything. Oh, the Kubernetes stuff. So this will generate all the Kubernetes files as well. So if we were to go back to the project, that's just Docker Compose. If we go down to the Kubernetes, you'll see it generates Kubernetes CTL, which just is plain kubectl command, customization, and scaffold. So if you like any of those tools with Kubernetes, those are all there. And if you have a cluster, you can just run that command and it'll deploy it to your cluster. And so you can find all the code on GitHub. And I also published a blog post earlier this week, accept all the cookies, micro front ends for Java microservices. So this kind of goes through everything, in a little more detail and more steps. And the fun thing is I wrote a bunch of these blog posts like a month ago. They just took a while to get published. But believe it or not, it's Matt Raible week on the Auth0 blog. So there's that one. And then there's integrate React Native and Spring Boot securely. So we do have a React Native blueprint, we call it, for JHipster that allows you to actually generate a React Native client that talks to a JHipster backend. So this shows you how to do that. That was just published this morning.
Does it support React Web?
It does. Yep.
Okay.
Yep. And it's funny because we have a React SDK, a React Native SDK at Okta and Auth0, and they do not. Right? The examples just don't have the reactive web stuff in there, but the guy who wrote the blueprint for JHipster put it all in there, so it's pretty slick. So I also wanted to talk about secure microservices with OAuth 2, but I wanted to, I'm feeling more hip as I do it. So these are my speaker notes because I'm not able to see them here, so that's why I have them here. And the reason I want to talk about OAuth 2.1, I meant to say instead of 2.0, is because it is like the best things in OAuth. OAuth is a big spec. It basically came out in 2012, I think, and then OpenID Connect was added in 2014. And it has a lot of stuff that the browsers kind of didn't do before. So, for instance, CORS wasn't there. Cross-origin resource sharing wasn't available in the browsers. And so there's this thing called implicit flow that returns your access token, your ID tokens, like in the browser. And so if you're doing any sort of web server logging, there's a chance those tokens are in your web server logs, right? So that's not good. So that's the implicit flow there, item number 3, that's omitted, right? And then Pixie is required for all clients using the authorization code flow. So Pixie is proof key for code exchange, and that's basically using a client secret, but doing it like on the client. So if you're doing a spa or you're doing a mobile app, you should never have a client secret in it because those can be reverse engineered. People can get that client secret out. And if they have the ID and the secret and the issuer, they can basically impersonate your app. That happened to Twitter. Twitter is using in their actual app that they're distributing to everyone, had their client ID and client secret in there. And so even though we're using Twitter to post to our accounts or whatever, someone reverse engineered it and got it and then could post to everyone's accounts, right? So that's not good. It's happened a few times where people have done it badly. Facebook had an issue where you were able to take over someone else's account, and that was a lot because the the token, the access token, could be shared among people and could be captured and could be used by someone else. The redirect URIs, I showed you that there was that code/OIDC. That was an example of a redirect URI. Some providers support wildcards. Keycloak supports wildcards. In JHipster, we just say localhost : right? Any port you can go to. And it's funny because Okta, for the longest time, I would always tell people, the reason we don't support wildcards is we're conforming to the spec, right? We're doing the right thing. And we just added wildcard support last year. So I'm like, darn it. So I think, part of the problem with all this is that I don't know if any identity providers are only going to provide 2.1.
Working at Equifax is for those who want to grow, live fully, realize their true potential, and be a force for good. Simply put, here is where you can power your possible. Because at Equifax, we're wired for growth. A global data analytics and technology company driven by performance and innovation, where you can surround yourself with the brightest minds in the industry who bring passion and unique perspectives and who share in creative collaboration. It's a place to not only drive and develop your career, but where you're empowered to learn new skills, showcase your abilities, and become the best version of you. Grow in our vibrant and inclusive culture, where you can live your best and make a positive impact. Join us and find out what it really means to power your possible.
Right? They're going to provide the old school because they want more customers. It's not like, they actually want to keep people out. But if you're a new provider, you want to build a new identity provider, try to conform to this, try to eliminate some things, especially the resource owner password credentials grant, because that's basically sending a username and password. And the whole point of OAuth is to not send a username and password. So I'll walk you through how OAuth works, and hopefully that'll help you understand a bit better. In this example, back in like 2005, 2006, you would have signed up for Yelp in the US to find restaurants or something like that, or maybe you would sign up for LinkedIn, right? And the end of that process, it would prompt you to invite your friends, right? We see that all the time these days, but back then, what it would give you is a dialog for your Gmail username and password. And guess what? People did it, right? People were like, yeah, I'll give you my credentials. Well, then there was nothing that prevented LinkedIn from holding on to those credentials, right? And trying again in 4 months to see if you have any new contacts and sending them emails. So the whole point of OAuth was delegated authorization, right? You delegate Google Contacts the ability to give Yelp your contacts, right? So you're connecting with Google, and then you're getting that access token, and then you're coming back, giving it to the app, which is Yelp, and then it can talk to your resources. So in this example, client is Yelp, resource owner is you. You click on that button, and you go to the authorization server, right? In this case, it's accounts.google.com. You are passing in that redirect URI. You do control that. One of the biggest problems I've seen with people using something like Osio or Okta is they get an error that's like, the redirect URI is not valid, and they're just baffled, right? But if they went into the app and they looked at the redirect URI they're passing in, it doesn't match, right? So like once you understand it, it's pretty easy to know that you just have to copy that value out of your URL, go add it to your app, and everything will work. But like, in development, you might have localhost. In production, you're going to have to add the localhost, or not localhost, but whatever your production domain is. And you also pass in the scopes, OpenID and profile. So those are standard scopes, and there's about 10 of them that OpenID provides. And in the beginning, OAuth 2.0 didn't have any identity. And in fact, it says in the spec that it has nothing to do with authentication. It's only for authorization. And in fact, even an access token can just be a random string of characters. It can even be like 10 characters long, right? That's not a JWT that you can decode and like look at information. It's just a random string. And the funny thing about a JWT is before you decode it, it's just a random string of characters, right? So it totally fits with that whole authorization server thing. So you put in your credentials. If you're already logged in, you won't even see that screen, right? It'll just give you maybe a consent screen that says, will you allow Yelp to access your public profile and contacts? It'll go back to that URI with an authorization code. And then your app will call that authorization server and exchange that code for an access token and an ID token. And so that all happens, if you're Spring Boot using JHipster, that happens on the back end, right? There's nothing that you see on the front end. If you're using like a SPA app like Angular and React and you're using an SDK that does OpenID Connect, you will actually see that happen like, in your browser console, but it's not happening above in the browser, right? It's doing the XHR stuff. And then you can also access a user info endpoint. So the reason that OpenID came about was because companies like Facebook and Google had a /me endpoint. And they were using an access token to get the identity information from there because sometimes you need identity, right? And so all that OpenID Connect did was really standardize that and gave it a user info endpoint instead of a /me endpoint. So that's kind of slick. Spring Cloud Gateway, the funny story about this site I like to show is I did a blog post that used this diagram in it, and I just whipped it up myself in OmniGraffle, and I actually had someone from Volkswagen on LinkedIn ping me and say, how did you know our architecture? And I was like, it's pretty simple, right? Like, come on, is that your whole architecture? Like, it looks pretty easy, right? But in this case, you're a client, you're on that computer, you would authorize on Okta, and then you would come back to the gateway. And how Spring Cloud Gateway works is as a token relay filter that you can just forward that access token down to your downstream microservices. But you don't have to use, that's the user's access token, right? So if you want to have like no identity information between your microservices, you could use what's called client credentials from that gateway to talk down to those microservices, and there would be no identity in there. So it kind of depends on how you want to set things up. But in JHipster, this is all the configuration we have to actually pass that access token to those downstream services to make all the OAuth stuff work. So that's pretty slick. We also had to integrate Spring Cloud Gateway, as I said before, instead of Zool, because when we implemented the reactive stuff, we didn't want a non-reactive gateway, right? And so I blogged about all that in this article here on reactive microservices, Spring Cloud Gateway. And this was kind of how I learned Spring Cloud Gateway. Like I wrote an example, wrote a blog post, and then went and integrated into JHipster. And it was a lot easier because we had the simple example working first, right? And then everything I talked about today is in this blog post. And since we talked about security, I have one of my last props here, an Okta shirt. All right, since we're all secure now. This is great to work through airports. When I was actually, so if you leave from Dublin or Galway, there's like US Customs, right? And I think I was in Galway and the lady was like, you need to talk to my manager, and like pulled me aside, and then she was like, I'm just kidding, it's your shirt, right? But most people don't smile, right? Like the TSA agents, like rarely do they smile, right? So I've recently switched from trying to anger people at the airport to wearing like a tie-dye shirt, because then they're like, ah, he's harmless. So this was just published this week if you wanted to go read everything we talked about today. And this builds on this blog post, right, which I mentioned that has a monolith UI. And then I think this is important because if you're doing anything with Kubernetes, like one of the biggest things is they have this thing called Kubernetes secrets, which is the worst name because they're not secret. They're base64 encoded strings, right? Like anyone could decode them on the command line or in a browser or wherever, right? And so what I show in this blog post is how to use this project called kubectl that actually encrypts your secrets, uses like a separate, pod in your whole architecture. And you can actually then check in your secrets to source control because they are encrypted.
Is that a Kubernetes plugin, kubectl, or is it
Okay. If you Google it, it's a GitHub project. I think it's from Bitnami, is the company that created it.
The applications you need require performance, the performance of a real-time enterprise. Build the intelligent applications your users demand with an open source data platform. A global bank seized an opportunity by offering loans to customers getting notified of insufficient funds. Real-time analysis provides a contextual understanding of the customer, and a loan is offered. The right offer at the right time boosts conversions. Reaching customers in the real-time enterprise requires fast, scalable operations on data. An in-memory data layer between the backend and new apps is proven to reduce latency and boost throughput for machine learning and artificial intelligence. Microservices, digital integration hubs. Think beyond the possible. The era of real-time enterprise is here, and Hazelcast can help.
And I mentioned a few different options in that blog post as well. And JHipster is part of the dev community, so if you see in dev.to, if you don't have a blog post or blog and you want to start one, it's a pretty good place to do it. And we have blog posts on a number of different things. So I took that reactive microservices architecture and deployed it to Google Cloud with kubectl and showed people how to do that. But then, not everyone uses Google Cloud, so we did one for Azure with Cosmos DB. We did one for DigitalOcean with Kubernetes, which was actually a very pleasant experience. I QA'd all of these, and DigitalOcean was like, wow, that just worked, and they have a nice UI and stuff. AWS with Amazon Elastic Kubernetes Service, and AWS, it's the worst one from a developer's perspective. From my perspective, right? Like everyone above us loves it, right? Because they see the bills and it's cheaper or whatever, but you're always like, oh, it's so many primitives, right? Why can't you just be like DigitalOcean or Heroku and everything just works? And then we also have one that I really enjoyed doing, the CI/CD Java microservices with Circle CI and Spinnaker. So one of our writers took that same post and did Circle CI for all the different microservices, and then used Spinnaker to coordinate it all and do continuous deployment. And so that was another one that once you got everything working, you were like, wow, this is pretty cool, right? To know how to do that. And you might be asking, what about Kotlin? So we do have what's called a Kotlin blueprint. So if you installed generator JHipster Kotlin, then you could actually generate this whole microservices architecture with Kotlin, or you could generate a monolith or a gateway or whatever and have Kotlin on your back end instead of Java. And we have a number of other blueprints. So what blueprints allows you to do is basically override a portion of JHipster. So a company might use it to implement their standard, maybe they have a different persistence mechanism, right? They could do that instead of Hibernate and JPA, or instead of Mongo. So we have Kotlin. We actually have a .NET Core backend. So if you don't like Java at all, you can use that. That's for the React Native front end. There's also an Ionic and Angular front end. And then Nest.js, so if you want to do a Node backend, you could do that. Micronaut Quarkus. The Micronaut guys actually wrote the blueprint for Micronaut. So a couple years ago, top notch, worked really well. And there's been some maintenance on it, but we haven't quite got it to Micronaut 3 yet. We're working on that now. Quarkus is kind of like people are excited about it, now no one works on it. So I recently said I will work on it, and so hopefully by the end of the year we'll have a new release of that. And then this bottom right one is for Svelte. So if you wanted to use a Svelte UI, you can do that with that blueprint. There's also some other ones that aren't mentioned here. Entity Audit, so if you want to audit your entities, that's another blueprint. Spring Native, which I helped write earlier this year, works awesome, but with Spring Boot 3 you won't need it because native support is going to be built in. And then JOOQ, so if you want to use that as a persistence mechanism, there is a blueprint for that. And then you might be like, well, hey, JHipster generates like all these files and 10,000 files for a new project, like what the heck? JHipster Lite was designed to address that. It just generates like a shell. And any like logical code you want to put in there, it expects you to use domain-driven design concepts with like adapters and inputs and outputs and stuff like that. So it supports a lot of the same technologies that JHipster does. It's just more of a lightweight version and not really generating CRUD or anything like that for you. We do have a strong interest in making it support JDL somehow, right, and allowing you to use that definition to build your JHipster Lite apps. But right now it's very much like start.spring.io. So if you go to lite.jhipster.tech, you will see the UI where you could generate an app from that. And all the rest is use JHipster for it. And so today you learned about microservices, Spring Boot, Spring Cloud, JHipster, micro front ends, and OAuth. And you might be asking what's next for JHipster, Spring Boot 3, right? I made good progress on that this week. It does start up, and some things don't work when you run certain tests or with certain technologies. And I would like to see for the OAuth portion of it to use Skim, because it is a standard out there that works pretty well, and it's a system for cross-domain identity management. And how it works, a buddy of mine is writing an Apache Skimple project. We basically found this project at Apache that implemented Skim and was done by the University of Pennsylvania, and all the people wrote their masters and then left, right? And they were like, we're not going to work on it anymore. But him and I are both Apache committers, so we're like, hey, if we can revive this, we can show people how to use it, because how it works right now is JHipster requires you to log in to get your user in any user dropdown, right? So that's kind of a painful system because you should be able to look up your users from your identity provider. So how Skim works is you embed it in your app, and then it has certain endpoints, and it will communicate with your identity provider to make sure your users are in sync, which is kind of cool, right? And then GraphQL is a personal interest of mine because it's fun to talk about. It's interesting to a lot of people, but it's kind of one of those that you're like, how do we implement it? Do we rip everything out, or do we use our existing REST endpoints and then just allow you to use GraphQL, right? So haven't quite gone there, but there's a lot of discussion on an issue out there. If you were to search for it, you'd find it. But what I like to tell people a lot is JHipster is knowledge, right? It's the ability to know how to hook up, Spring Boot and Angular or React and TypeScript and stuff like that. Like you can just generate apps and then look at it. Because a lot of times we aren't developing brand new apps, right? We're not doing greenfield development. We just need to figure out how to do something. So JHipster provides a way of doing that. And if you want identity options, right, it's got JWT authentication, it's got OIDC and OAuth, or it's even got session if you want to use that. So it's all icing on the cake from there, works pretty nice. And if you want to learn more, there's the Spring Boot guides, which are excellent. So if you're new to Spring Boot, I encourage you to check out those. Most of them are like 15, 20-minute tutorials that you can do quickly. The JHipster website's at jhipster.tech. Okta's API is at developer.okta.com. And Stack Overflow is often the lead developer on my team. So, there's a lot of good answers out there. And then we have lots of tutorials on the Okta developer blog. Our handle is OktaDev at GitHub, YouTube, and Twitter there. And we also have developer.auth0.com. I like Auth0 because it's orange like the Denver Broncos. But they've actually changed, so they've taken the orange out of the logo, and now it's like black or white. And I'm like, you took the color out, but I can still put a background in that's orange, right? So they have an excellent developer hub. It's way better than the Okta one. And it's got all kinds of code examples, tutorials, and a real good way to like connect with the community. And so my action to you is try JHipster, right? Install it, use an npm generator JHipster 7, and try it out. See if you can get some apps working. And the last thing in my props was that a hipster drinks Beamish. All right. It's kind of like Guinness that way. So you can use the source, right? All the code that I showed today is in this repository. I just wrote it a couple weeks ago, so it's all up to date. Thank you for coming. If you want to keep in touch, my website's at Raible Designs. I'm on Twitter at mraible. Presentation's already on speaker deck from tonight, so if you go there, I uploaded it right before we talked. And then a lot of the code I do these days is on Okta Dev, so may the auth be with you.